Week 5, Lesson 4, Horror Comics, Part 2. No look at horror comics would be complete without a good examination of EC Comics. Not to be confused with DC Comics, EC Comics stood for Educational Comics, and later, Entertainment Comics. Educational Comics, or EC Comics, was founded by Max Gaines, whose real name was Maxwell Ginsberg, who started EC Comics after the company he worked for, All American Publications, was bought out by DC Comics. When that company was bought out, Gaines made sure he retained the rights to picture stories from the Bible, which is exactly what it sounds like. He also wanted to make comics about science. His plan was to sell comics to schools and churches. It wasn't as successful as you might think. Remember that the Army was hesitant to use comics to explain how to fix and maintain equipment? Well, schools and churches were just as hesitant to use the medium of comics to educate students. While comics were popular enough with youth, using them as teaching tools hadn't been tested, so educational comics were mostly put aside in favor of traditional textbooks and religious books. EC Comics would probably not have even been mentioned in this course if it wasn't for Max Gaines' early death. On August 27, 1947, he died in a boating accident, and it was up to his son, William Gaines, to take over the company. William Gaines, or Bill Gaines, was born in 1922 and died in 1992, at the age of 70. He wasn't interested in comics. He was studying to become a chemistry teacher when his father died. He didn't want to take over his father's educational comics, but from what I can gather, his mother guilt-tripped him into it, saying that the company was all that was left of his father, or something to that effect. Every report that I could find about William Gaines' relationship with his father was that he couldn't stand the guy. William Gaines felt bullied by his father, who he always felt was trying to toughen him up and send him down a different path than the one he wanted. There was one report that as a kid helping his dad out in the studio, William took too long getting lunch, and his dad, Max, gave him a vicious kick in front of everyone. So it's safe to say that their relationship was abusive. So when Gaines got the company, he went to one of the artists that he knew growing up and asked for advice. He was shown a list of guidelines that his father, Max, gave the artists. Among other things, it included: never show anyone being stabbed or shot, never show a scene of torture, never show a hypodermic needle, and never show a coffin, especially if there's a body in it. Bill Gaines looked at those limitations, and the first thing he did was throw them away. The self-censorship of what violence you could or couldn't show was about to be eliminated at EC Comics. The next important thing was that the educational comics were gone. EC no longer stood for educational comics, it stood for entertaining comics. Another big factor that led to the company's success was that it no longer standardized its art. One of the things that you might notice while reading comics from the 1940s was that many of the companies, like DC, developed a certain, almost bland style which became uniform over their series. This was done for several reasons. It's what the reader expected, it was a way of maintaining quality control, it was a way to produce comics quicker, and it was in a way to easily replace artists if they wanted a pay raise or started gaining an ego. Bill Gaines let artists develop their own unique styles, which allowed the books to look visually more dynamic, and allowed the artists to have more fun while drawing. In the early 1950s, EC released 9 comic book titles, none of which were superhero related. They released the crime suspense stories, shock suspense stories, those were their crime comics. They released weird science and weird fantasy as their science fiction stories. They released Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales as their war comics. But what they were most famous for were their horror titles. The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, and most famously, Tales from the Crypt. Tales from the Crypt started out as a series called Crime Patrol. It briefly became the Crypt of Terror for 3 issues, and then moved to the title that we know it as today. Like Crime Does Not Pay, the short stories had a mascot, who became one of the most famous, or infamous, mascots in horror. I'm talking about the Crypt Keeper. He was the reader's guide into the world of horror, who would bookend the short stories. He'd tell the readers the premise in the first panel, and then ask the readers what they thought of the story in the last one. He'd narrate the stories for the benefit of the readers, throwing in many puns to lighten the otherwise gloomy mood of the stories. This attitude of playfully talking to your audience while in a mostly serious story would go on to be imitated by many writers in the future, including Stan Lee. Most of the stories here would either have a clear moral message or would be considered a black comedy more than actual horror stories. They were known for having ironic or twist endings. This style of creating an anthology series would later be on display on television in The Twilight Zone, a series whose stories would have felt completely welcome at EC, but The Twilight Zone had the benefit of being for a more respectable medium of television. As you can expect, children and young teens made these comics a success. Such a success that, like with all other popular trends in comics, there were dozens of imitators. While EC Comics wasn't the first company to write horror comics, they were credited with starting the horror phase of the industry. Comics had many other less successful attempts, including PL Publishing's Weird Adventures in 1951, which lasted 1 issue as a crime comic and 2 as a horror. Ace Comics' Web of Mystery had 29 comics from 51 to 55. Ajax Farrell Publications' Fantastic Fears lasted 9 issues from 53 to 54. Avon Comics' Witchcraft lasted 6 issues from 52 to 53. Charleston Comics' The Thing lasted 17 issues, 52 to 54. Comic Media's Weird Terror had 13 issues from 52 to 54. Fawcett Comics' World of Fear 9 issues, 52 to 53. Harvey Comics' Tomb of Terror and Witch's Tales 16 issues from 52 to 54 and 30 issues from 51 to 54, respectively. Key Publications' Weird Mystery was out in 54. Weird Chills from 54, and arguably Weird Tales from the Future from 52 to 53. Quality Comics' Web of Evil, which had 21 issues, came out from 52 to 54. Star Publications' Ghostly Weird Stories also had 5 issues from 53 to 54. St. John's Weird Horrors lasted 9 issues from 52 to 53. Ziff David's Weird Tales had 5 issues from 51 to 52. DC Comics even tried to get into horror comics with its House of Mystery series, lasting an impressive 321 issues, which went from 51 to 83. It was the clear victor out of all the horror series that followed EC's success. So, why are most of these forgotten, but Tales of the Crypt is still known today? Well, part of it's thanks to Tales from the Crypt getting a live-action movie and television show, as well as an animated series. But the other thing that let Tales from the Crypt stand out was that it had a distinct sense of humor about itself, from the Crypt Keeper calling the readers fiendish fans, and himself the master of ceremonies, to the ironic twist endings that brought about some sort of twisted justice. For example, Tales from the Crypt issue number 25 had a story about a big game hunter who killed animals and planted their heads on his wall. He got captured himself and has his head put on display by the end of the comic. Many of the other comics listed tried really hard to shock the reader and would just throw in some gore and death to try and get a reaction out of their readers. While they weren't really scary, they were just pushing the limits of violence and traditional story structure to surprise the reader. Horror comics were still huge and becoming very visible in the comic book industry. Gone were the innocence and hopes of superheroes, now stories were about sin and gore. At least that's what the critics thought. And the parents of those potentially future juvenile delinquents were not going to take the sitting down. They were going to make some noise until someone did something about what they saw as an abuse of free speech. So, why are horror comics important to this course? Because they influenced horror for decades to come. Horror comics showed that comics could succeed in telling a scary story better than movies or television could at the time. Horror comics, along with romance comics and crime comics, were completely outselling the superhero genre. Horror comics showed what comics, and entertainment in general, would be like without having to deal with censors, or target the broadest audience possible to guarantee results. Horror comics were what led EC to go from an unimportant publisher to an overnight sensation. Questions to contemplate. What is the youngest age you'd recommend someone be to read these comics?